Summer 1945. The war in Europe was over. But for thousands of German prisoners scattered across the American South, it didn't feel like peace. It felt like exile. Among them were dozens of German women, clerks, nurses, and support staff, rounded up in the final chaotic days. They had been told nothing of where they were going, only that they were being sent overseas. When the ship finally docked and the trucks rolled out into the open countryside, the first thing they felt was heat. Not sunlight, heat. A wall of it, heavy, slow, and merciless. The kind that made your breath stick to your lips. One of them, a young woman named Liesel, pressed her hand to the glass window of the transport truck and whispered, "Mein Gott, is this America?" The others didn't answer. They were too busy fanning themselves with their sleeves, coughing on the dust, watching the endless horizon. Nothing but yellow fields, dry fences, and the occasional water tower cutting through the sky. Texas. They had imagined America as a country of sharp edges, steel, concrete, smoke, a place of power and cruelty. But this was something else entirely. The truck jolted to a stop. The door slammed open. "All right, ladies," a voice called in English. "End of the line." The women stepped down one by one, their boots sinking into the cracked earth. The sun hit them like a blow. They squinted. The air shimmered so hot it looked alive. Everything buzzed, flies, engines, far-off insects. The camp wasn't what they expected. No barbed wire coils, no shouting guards. Just a few long wooden barracks surrounded by fences and watchtowers. And in the distance, a small white house with a porch swing that moved gently in the breeze. It looked less like a prison, and more like a farm. Still, they were cautious. The soldiers around them wore wide-brimmed hats, khaki shirts rolled to the elbow, and belts that gleamed in the sun. They weren't smiling, but they weren't angry either. Just quiet. Calm. One of the women, Greta, older, with streaks of grey in her hair, tried to straighten her uniform. She had survived the fall of Berlin, the long march through France, and the bitter Atlantic voyage. She expected humiliation next, maybe even violence. Instead, one of the American guards pointed toward a small building and said, in a low, respectful tone, "Water's inside, ma'am." "Ma'am?" She froze. For months she'd been called enemy, prisoner, Frau. Never ma'am. The word hit harder than any insult. They filed inside the building, a mess hall that smelled faintly of dust and wood polish. It was cool inside, shaded by heavy curtains. And there, lined along a wooden table, they saw something so strange it didn't make sense at first. Metal buckets, dozens of them. And inside, clear, glittering ice. At first they thought it was glass. One woman reached out, touched it, and flinched. "It's frozen." She pulled her hand back, shaking from the cold. Liesel stared in disbelief. She hadn't seen ice in over a year, not since before the bombings, before the rations, before everything froze into fear and hunger. The Americans just stood there, watching, not laughing, not gloating, just waiting. "Cool yourselves," one said quietly. "You'll need it." Some of the women looked suspicious. Was this a test? A cruel trick? They'd heard stories, propaganda back home about Americans torturing prisoners, about humiliation and shame. But this? Greta bent down, lifted a cube between her fingertips, and held it to her face. It melted slowly, running down her cheek like a tear. She didn't move, didn't speak. In that moment the room was silent, except for the faint hum of an electric fan. One by one the women reached for the ice. They pressed it to their wrists, their necks, their faces. A few of them began to laugh, soft, nervous laughter that broke into tears. It was too much, too unexpected. Liesel whispered, almost to herself, "They treat us like people." Outside, the sun blazed on, burning the dry Texas fields. The air shimmered with heat, but inside that wooden barracks, the women stood surrounded by ice, small glistening symbols of mercy in a war that had shown them none. Later, as evening fell, they were led to their quarters. Wooden bunks lined the walls, clean sheets, actual pillows, a faint smell of soap and hay. It was simple, but after the nightmare they'd endured, it felt like luxury. Through the window they could see the sky painted orange and red, the kind of sunset they'd only seen in postcards. Somewhere, an American soldier strummed a guitar, the lazy tune floating through the hot air. Liesel sat on her bunk and stared at her hands. They were blistered from the sun, still red from where she'd touched the ice. She whispered, "Maybe this is not punishment. Maybe this is something else." Greta nodded slowly. "Maybe it's forgiveness." That night the temperature dropped, Texas heat falling away into a still, heavy silence. Crickets sang. The women lay awake, unable to sleep, listening to the soft hum of the fan and the distant laughter of the guards outside. They couldn't understand it. Why kindness? Why here? When you've spent years being told the enemy is a monster and then you meet him, and he offers you water, shade, and ice, something inside you begins to crumble. For the first time in years, some of them prayed, not for victory, not for Germany, not even for freedom, but for understanding. In the dark, Liesel whispered, "If this is the enemy, then what were we fighting for?" A single tear rolled down her cheek. It felt cold. When morning came, the heat returned with vengeance. The sun glared white, and the dirt shimmered like metal. But something had changed inside the women. They still wore their tattered uniforms, still carried the fear and guilt of a lost war, but their eyes were different now, softer, curious, almost human again. And when one of the American guards passed by and said with a smile, "Coffee's hot, but we got ice for that too," Liesel actually smiled back. For the first time since capture, she wasn't afraid. They came expecting chains. They found ice. They came expecting hate. They found hospitality. The desert sun of Texas had melted more than the snow in their hearts. It had melted everything they thought they knew about war. Morning in Texas didn't arrive quietly. It slammed open like a furnace. By 7 a.m., the air was already thick, heavy, alive with cicadas that sang like broken engines. The women stepped out of their barracks, shielding their eyes from the sun, and were met with the strange sight of American soldiers pouring buckets of water over their heads, laughing, shouting, their khaki shirts already soaked through. It looked like chaos, but there was joy in it. Simple, human joy. Liesel stood frozen in the doorway, clutching her tin mug. The heat pressed down like a weight, and yet, for the first time, she felt a strange kind of freedom. A soldier noticed her watching and called out, "You'll get used to it, ma'am. Texas don't do gentle mornings." She didn't understand the words, but his tone made her smile. A few minutes later, the women were gathered in the mess hall. A fan rattled somewhere above. The smell of eggs and fried potatoes filled the room, a smell so thick and warm it made their stomachs ache. Food, real food. They hadn't seen a breakfast like that since before the war. Plates were handed out, scrambled eggs, toast, fruit, butter so yellow it looked unreal. But it was the drink that truly puzzled them. Cold, pale, floating with cubes of ice that clinked like bells. "Lemonade," said one of the guards, smiling. "Sugar, water, lemons, and a miracle." The women stared at the glass. One of them sniffed it suspiciously. Liesel took the first sip. The taste hit her like sunlight. Sweet, sour, Alive. Her throat tightened. For a second she couldn't swallow, not because it was bad, but because it was too good. She lowered the glass and whispered, "It tastes like peace." Around her, laughter broke out, soft at first, then genuine. Even Greta, always the skeptic, smiled and muttered, "Only America could make a drink colder than snow." Outside, the camp stirred to life. Trucks rumbled, flags flapped in the dry wind. A group of local Texans arrived, civilians, mostly farmers and ranchers, bringing supplies. One of them, an old man in a wide hat, leaned on the fence and stared at the women curiously. Then he lifted his hat and said politely, "Morning, ladies." The translator explained his words, and the women blinked in disbelief. No insults, no threats, just good morning. The old man waved to one of the soldiers. "Got something for 'em," he said. He opened the back of his truck. Inside were baskets of peaches, tomatoes, and bread wrapped in cloth. The kind of simple, honest food that could only come from someone's home. Liesel watched as the soldiers carried the baskets inside. One of them set a peach on her plate. She stared at it for a long moment, its skin glowing orange and red in the sunlight. She hadn't seen fruit that fresh in years. She bit into it, and the juice ran down her chin. She didn't even care. She laughed, wiping her face with her sleeve. Around her, others did the same. The room filled with quiet laughter, the sound of people remembering what it meant to be alive. Later that afternoon, the sun grew cruel again. The ground shimmered like glass. Work details were called out, and the women were led to the fields to pick vegetables alongside American laborers. There were no guards shouting orders, no threats, just work. Honest, tiring, sunburned work. At one point, Liesel felt dizzy from the heat. She tried to hide it, but one of the farm women, a Texan with her sleeves rolled up and freckles across her nose, noticed. Without a word, she walked over, handed Liesel her hat, and said, "Too hot for fair skin like yours. Take mine." Liesel didn't understand all the words, but she understood the gesture. She pressed the hat to her chest, nodding with tears in her eyes. The woman smiled. "Ain't no enemy in a heat like this." That night, back in the barracks, Liesel and Greta couldn't sleep. The fan hummed softly, stirring the air. Greta whispered, "I worked in a hospital during the war. We were told Americans hated us. We were told they burned prisoners alive." Liesel stared at the ceiling. "Maybe they hated the war. Not us." Silence hung heavy. Then Greta added, "If our men had treated their prisoners this way, maybe we would have won something worth winning." Outside, lightning flickered on the horizon. Silent heat lightning, flashing across the clouds like the memory of explosions. But there was no fear in it now, only awe. The next morning brought something unexpected. Visitors. A group of Texas women from the nearby town came to the camp, carrying sewing kits, soap, and small boxes wrapped in paper. The guards explained. Local families had heard about the lady prisoners and wanted to help. One box was handed to Liesel. Inside was a simple white dress, neatly folded, smelling faintly of lavender. Her hands shook as she lifted it. "For me?" The soldier nodded. "From a Mrs. Wilson. Says it's too hot for uniforms." For a long moment, Liesel couldn't speak. Then she pressed the fabric to her face and whispered, "Danke." When she stepped outside wearing that dress, the camp went quiet. She didn't look like a prisoner anymore. She looked like a person. A few of the American soldiers even clapped lightly, one saying, "Well, look at that. Texas air does magic." That night, the camp hosted something strange, a small gathering half by accident. The local families had brought a portable radio. Someone played muse, sick, slow country songs about home and love. And without realizing how or why, one of the German women started humming along. Then another. Then an American soldier joined in. Within minutes, the air was filled with laughter and clapping. They couldn't understand each other's words, but the rhythm didn't need translation. Liesel spun slowly under the stars, her bare feet on the warm dirt, her dress glowing white in the moonlight. For a moment she forgot everything: the war, the camps, the pain. Greta watched her and smiled faintly. "She's dancing in Texas," she murmured. "Who would have believed that?" Later, as the crowd thinned and the lights dimmed, Liesel sat alone near the fence. A soldier approached, the same one who'd offered her water on the first day. He held a small bucket filled with ice and 2 tin cups. "Thought you might want something cold," he said. She smiled nervously, taking the cup. "Danke, thank you." He nodded. "Heat's bad, but you'll get used to it. We all do." They sat in silence for a while, sipping water, listening to the hum of the Texas night. Finally, Liesel asked, "Why you do this? For us?" He stared at the ground. "Because we all got mothers, sisters, folks who deserve better than hate. Maybe this is how we start over." Her eyes softened. "In Germany, we were told Americans had no mercy." He smiled faintly. "Guess someone lied." The night stretched on. Crickets sang. Somewhere, an owl called. Liesel felt the ice melt in her cup, dripping down her fingers. She looked at him and said quietly, "In Germany, we prayed for victory. Here, I pray for forgiveness." He didn't answer. He just tipped his cup toward her and said softly, "To new starts." They drank, and for the first time since the war began, she felt human again. By the time the moon reached its highest point, most of the camp had fallen asleep. But Liesel sat awake, staring at the stars. Texas wasn't gentle. It was harsh, burning, wild. But it had shown her something her homeland never had: mercy without reason. She realized something that night. Sometimes the greatest kindness comes not from friends, but from those who have every reason to hate you, and don't. They came expecting chains, but found lemonade and laughter. They came expecting punishment, but found people who simply refused to be cruel. The war had ended months ago, but inside the Texas camp, time moved differently. Each sunrise carried the same smell of dust and hay, the same heat that wrapped around everything like a living creature. Yet something had shifted. The guards no longer called them prisoners. The locals no longer looked at them with fear. They had become, strangely, neighbors. Liesel had started keeping a small notebook, one she'd made, from scraps of paper. Every morning she sat by the fence and wrote down small things that felt worth remembering: the way the sun turned the grass silver at dawn, the laughter from the kitchen, the way a soldier always whistled before roll call. She called it the sound of forgiveness. One August morning, a truck arrived covered in dust. It wasn't carrying food or supplies this time. It carried envelopes. Real letters. Each prisoner would be told where she was going next. Some were to be repatriated. Others would stay to help with farm labor until ships became available. When the officer called Liesel's name, her stomach twisted. He handed her an envelope with an American seal. She tore it open carefully. It said she was to be transferred to a processing camp in Louisiana before returning to Germany. In a few weeks, she'd be home. Home. The word didn't feel real anymore. What was home? The city she'd left in ruins, the faces she'd lost, or the strange, sunburned land where people had treated her with a mercy she hadn't believed possible. That afternoon, as the women gathered near the shade of the barn, Greta sighed. "Do you think they'll hate us when we return?" Liesel didn't answer right away. She thought of Mrs. Wilson's lavender-scented dress, of the farm woman who'd given her a hat, of the soldier who'd shared ice in silence. "Maybe," she said finally, "but maybe it doesn't matter anymore. We've seen another way." The wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain. Thunder rolled somewhere far away. It felt like the sky itself was restless, waiting for goodbye. That night, the camp was quieter than usual. Dinner was simple: beans, cornbread, and slices of peach. The guards spoke softly. Even the laughter seemed careful, fragile. Everyone knew this might be their last meal together. When the plates were cleared, a soldier brought out the old radio again. The music that played was Namans. It was military this time. It was slow, mournful country, a song about leaving home and finding it again. One by one, people began to drift outside to listen under the stars. Liesel sat on the wooden steps of the barracks. The sky above Texas looked enormous, bigger than anything she'd seen in Europe. She whispered to Greta, "I used to think the world ended at Germany's borders. Now I see how small we really were." Greta smiled sadly. And how big forgiveness can be. The next morning, the sun rose red. Trucks lined up outside the gates, their engines rumbling. The women packed their few belongings: small keepsakes, letters, pieces of cloth from local women. The guards walked among them, shaking hands, giving directions, helping them climb onto the trucks. It felt less like an evacuation and more like a strange farewell among friends. The same soldier who had offered Liesel ice walked up, wiping sweat from his brow. "You'll catch a train to New Orleans," he said. "Then a ship home. Long ride ahead." She nodded. "Thank you for everything." He smiled, shifting his cap. "Don't thank me, ma'am. Just remember the heat, the ice, and the lemonade. Texas hospitality, hard to forget." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he reached into his pocket and handed her a folded paper. "Figured you'd want to write something before you go, for yourself." She held the paper to her chest. "I will." The trucks started moving. Dust rose around them like smoke. Liesel looked back through the wooden slats as the camp grew smaller, the barracks fading into the shimmer of heat. The soldier raised his hand in farewell. She lifted hers until he disappeared from sight. Hours later, when the sun began to sink, the convoy stopped near a river for rest. The air smelled of pine and mud. The women climbed down, stretching their legs, dipping their hands into the cool water. Liesel sat apart from the others and unfolded the paper he'd given her. Using a small pencil stub, she began to write. "To the man who gave us ice, you will never know what that meant. We came expecting hate and foe and humanity. We came broken and were treated as women again. When I drink cold water now, I will remember this place, where mercy felt like snow in summer." When she finished, she folded it carefully and tucked it inside her notebook. The convoy rolled on through endless plains. The Texas sky bled into violet, then black. Stars began to appear one by one. As she drifted to sleep, she could still taste the lemon on her tongue, still hear the faint hum of the fan in the barracks. Weeks passed. The women reached the Louisiana camp, green, humid, nothing like Texas. It rained every day. The guards were polite but distant. There were no peaches, no radios, no laughter. Liesel found herself missing the unbearable heat she once cursed. One evening, standing beneath a leaky roof, she opened her notebook again and read the pages aloud in whispers. The sound of forgiveness, she'd called it, and now she understood why. Forgiveness wasn't a gift someone handed you. It was something you decided to keep, even when the world forgot how. Finally, the ship came. Grey, enormous, smelling of salt and diesel. As they boarded, an officer handed each woman a small paper bag with a sandwich and an apple. On top of Liesel's bag lay a single cube of ice wrapped in wax paper, melting fast. She didn't know who had placed it there. She didn't need to. She smiled, whispered, "Texas," and watched it melt away in her palm. The sea voyage home was long and restless. The women leaned against the rails at night, staring into the black water, wondering what awaited them. Some spoke of rebuilding, Others feared punishment. But Liesel stayed quiet, thinking of lemonade and the way the soldier had said, "To new starts." When they finally reached Germany, the docks were silent. The air smelled of smoke and rubble. Families searched faces, calling names, hoping someone would answer. Liesel stepped off the ship and realized how much had changed. The sky here felt smaller, the wind colder. A reporter asked her, "What was America like?" She hesitated, then said simply, "Hot, kind, alive." Months later, she found work in a small clinic, helping children wounded by bombings. On her desk, she kept a single photograph, an old snapshot taken at the camp, given to her by a soldier before she left. In it, a group of German women laughed around a bucket of ice. The caption on the back read, "For when the world feels too warm again." Every morning she looked at that photo before starting her rounds, and sometimes, when she handed a child a cup of water, she'd drop in a single cube of ice and smile. Years passed. The war faded into textbooks and memories. Liesel grew old, her hair turning white, her hands steady from years of healing rather than hiding. But she never forgot Texas, the heat that punished, the people who forgave, and the miracle of something as simple as ice. In her final notebook entry she wrote, "We thought mercy was weakness, but mercy is strength, the kind that survives when everything else burns away." She placed the notebook inside a small wooden box and told her granddaughter, "If you ever go to America, visit Texas, tell them thank you for me." They came as prisoners. They left as witnesses. And somewhere, beneath that wide Texas sky, the echo of their laughter still lingers, cool as ice, warm as forgiveness.